You're always stuck in second gear. When it hasn't been your day, week, your month, or even your year. But I'll be there for you. When the rain starts to pour, I'll be there for you. Like I've been there before. I'll be there for you. So there for me too.
Hi, welcome to my crash course on Period 8, the Cold War, primarily from 1945 to about 1980-ish, and I hope you enjoy. We start right at the end of 1945. Germany is to be split up between the West and the East. The western side being the capitalist and the eastern side being the communist. The Yalta Conference concluded that the best way for the European countries to move on after World War II is if they decide their own fate by having democratically elected elections to decide what type of government they want and what their future will be. Stalin, who decides what Stalin wants, as for example the Great Purge, decided that Stalin wants to make all these Eastern European countries communist, a direct violation of the Yalta Conference. All these communist countries as well would have been heavily dominated and influenced by the Soviet Union, essentially being puppet or satellite states. May I reiterate that this was without the consent of the people. This infuriated the United States, bittering relations with the Soviet Union. Things would get worse after the United States would discover that Julius Rosenberg had given the Soviet Union plans on how to make an atomic bomb. Thus, this begins the Cold War. But he wasn't the only Soviet spy in the Manhattan Project. Another well-known one is also known as Klaus Fuchs, who helped deliver the plans as well. The main policy towards communism in the Cold War is containment. If we can't get rid of it, we gotta stop it from spreading. It's simple. This could be seen in both the Marshall Plan and the Truman Plan, made to help assist European countries after World War II and to avoid another economic crisis similar to that of the Great Depression. Its other purpose was to stop the Soviet Union in its tracks from creating more satellite states. The Truman Plan was essentially telling Greece and Turkey, I will give you money, don't go communist. Or anything close to that. Speaking of Greece, the Greek Civil War would start immediately after World War II. I'm talking mainly about the third phase of the war, where it really picked up, because there was some fighting in 1944 or so, but it wasn't nearly as brutal as the third phase, which would result in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The conflict was between a communist rebellion and the monarchy of Greece. The monarchy was supported by Great Britain until 1947, and the United States picked up where they left off until the war would end. The communists would be supported by Eastern Bloc countries, Yugoslavia being the biggest of them. It's surprising that this war is not seen as big as a deal as it was, because Greece would later go on to join NATO in 1951. The Soviet Union tries to cut off the whole world from, well, whole world being the communist world, from the West, as he saw people fleeing from the East to the West, which, boy, I would never understand why, because communism really, certainly, does work.
Once.
He's only this big. How many diapers could he possibly use? Oh, that's not so much. So?
Since they wanted to control more of Germany, they cut off the capitalist parts of Berlin from the outside world, meaning that they stopped food and supplies from getting into there. This was possible because Berlin was on the eastern side of Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union. In retaliation, the United States launched an air campaign in which they would drop supplies onto the capitalist parts of Berlin, known as the Berlin Airlift, until the Soviet Union stopped. In the east, the nationalist government of China is driven out by the communists. The nationalist government would escape to Taiwan and later become the country of Taiwan. At first, the United States would only recognize Taiwan as the real China and not communist China. There would be all sorts of trade in between Taiwan and the United States. You might be able to find some things from Taiwan in your house. But as the years went by, it was simply not really convenient anymore to keep doing this. So we ditched Taiwan in favor, not as in ditched, we basically just no longer accepted Taiwan as the main government of China and Communist China as the government of China. Then the Soviet Union would officially declare its alliance, its quote-unquote alliance, more like a puppet alliance of Eastern Europe, as the Warsaw Pact. In response, the West would create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. The United Nations would then get involved in Korea, mainly because there's a communist revolt going on over there between the North and the South. We all know how this ends. Though debatably this is not a war, it is a police action, said by some, but we kind of all know a conflict of this size is described as a war. With Chinese support, the North Koreans were able to push back against the United Nations, which was about to unify the Korean peninsula to the 30th parallel, the current borders of North and South Korea. The Soviet Union launches the first satellite into space, known as Sputnik. While it might just be a round ball of steel with antennas on it, it was pretty intimidating. Fears quickly arose that the Soviet Union could possibly, in a couple years, create a device that can launch nukes from space. Thus, the space race had begun, with the United States creating NASA in retaliation. While the Soviet Union would put the first person in space, first satellite, and first animals, the United States would put a man on the moon, meaning that we had successfully caught up and surpassed their technological feats. Thus, the space race had ended after the first man was on the moon. Now, back to land. The CIA and the United States government, well, basically the same thing, would be involved in a number of armed conflicts and coups. We all love this part now, don't we? Well, unless you're half of the entire globe, that is. To put it in perspective, in 1960 we got involved in the Congo, Brazil 1964, Dominican Republic 1965, Indonesia in 65, Bolivia in 71. We funded armed insurgencies in Iraq in 72 to 75. We got involved in Chile in 73, Afghanistan in 79 to 89, El Salvador in their little conflict in 1980 and 92, Nicaragua in 1989 to 89. I got that wrong, well, 82 to 89, but still, that's not all of it either. Probably the biggest examples is Cuba. Cuba we got really involved in, mainly because they went full commie. The United States funded a coup d'etat of sorts, or invasion, in the area known as the Bay of Pigs, to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government after they overthrow the US-backed Batista. This ends up being an utter disaster, and you probably all know this if all of you have played Black Ops 1. Importantly, this would also infuriate Cuba, opening up the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was kind of a big deal, because the Soviet Union, in response to the United States government putting nukes in Turkey, decided to put nukes in Cuba. That way, if anything hit the fan, they can hit almost anywhere in the United States. Eventually, the Soviet Union would take their missiles out of Cuba and get out. Relations with Cuba to this day are horrible because we embargoed them. That did not end well for them. To put that into perspective, one of the main reasons Japan, bombed Pearl Harbor was because of the embargo we put on them. Probably the other biggest coup the CIA and the United States got involved in was Guatemala, where Guatemala overthrew a electorally, democratically elected person, surprisingly with only a force of a couple hundred people. This was not really received well by the rest of the world. It was seen as a form of economic colonialism to some. But nonetheless, the revolt was, it worked out fine for the United States, and we had our sphere of influence expanded. Now onto the elephant in the room when you talk about the Cold War, Vietnam. This began way back at the end of World War II, when they started fighting for independence in the Indochina region of Asia. After declaring independence and fighting off the French, they declare, independence, as I just said, using some phrases from the United States Constitution. I believe the pursuit of happiness they used. Nonetheless, in the unstable area, a civil war breaks out between the North, which is, not say nationalist, but pro-anti-communist, and the communists in the South. The United States would have military action after a boat is damaged in the Gulf of Tonkin. The United States is nowhere ready for this type of warfare, guerrilla warfare, which even to this day is shown to be very hard to combat against for pretty much most militaries in the world. But United States Afghanistan. It's hard to fight, that's what I'm saying. It's hot, it's wet, there's all sorts of rain every time, every day. Constantly getting shot at and trying to find the enemies, only to see that they ran away. It's essentially just Florida, but in Asia. Booby traps like punji sticks, which are made to brutally or mortally wound United States soldiers to get them out of the fight and get other people out of the fight so they get those soldiers out of the fight. While casualties in the Vietnam side would be very high, this might be a little blown out of proportion because anyone could have been, seen as a Viet Cong, we kind of did level a couple villages now, did we? That, and like I said, anyone could have been a Viet Cong. The war would last through JFK, Kennedy, and Nixon. To an extent, Nixon would be the one to officially get us out of the war. The South, in early 1968, would launch a massive attack known as the Tet Offensive, which would be arguably a decisive, offensive, or string of battles, because it would be from January to September. While we did keep China out of the war by having less troops stationed in Taiwan, the war was still not easy. Morale was still incredibly low. Napalm and Agent Orange, didn't really work either, because they used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which could have been adjusted easily because it was made of dirt. Thus, the United States pulls out of Vietnam. We just fund North Vietnam until we just sit there and watch them fall. We also bombed the crap out of Laos, but that's not as exciting. One of the last portions of armed conflicts the United States would get in the Cold War would be later on, near the 90s, would be the invasion of Grenada and that of Panama. And that is a basic outline on the United States foreign policy in the Cold War, or Period 8. I hope you all enjoyed. I know I'm probably not the best to listen to, but I hope you all enjoyed. Bye.
Act in the national security interests of this country to get back in the business of creating a more peaceful world. Please clap.